In a courtroom thick with unresolved pasts, Judge Eleanor Reeves faces her greatest test. Michael Daniels, the man who jilted her 12 years ago, is back. But this time, he's in the dock of her courtroom. As she presides over his divorce case, unanswered questions and whispered histories pulse beneath the surface, threatening her calm facade. Recollections of a love lost collide with the harsh reality of judicial duty, as Eleanor wrestles with a conflict of interest that could unravel her meticulously rebuilt life. With every gavel strike, the tension mounts, secrets threaten to surface, and Eleanor must decide whether to uphold justice or address a heartbreak that never truly healed. Stay with us if you want to find out how the story ends, and don't forget to subscribe. The courtroom air hung thick with tension, recycled through aging vents that wheezed like reluctant lungs. Judge Eleanor Reeves adjusted her glasses, the weight of the black robe on her shoulders suddenly heavier than it had been moments before. The divorce case before her, Daniels versus Daniels, had seemed routine on paper. That was before she saw him. Michael Daniels. The same Michael who, 12 years earlier, had left her standing alone in a white dress before 200 guests, her father's arms still warm where it had been linked with hers, the echo of Pachelbel's cannon still hanging in the church air. Now he sat 10 feet away, unaware that the judge presiding over the dissolution of his second attempt at marriage was the woman whose first attempt he had prevented. Eleanor's fingers trembled imperceptibly against the manila folder. The clerk was speaking, something about exhibits, but all she could hear was the rush of blood in her ears and the distant memory of her own sobs in the church bridal suite. She should recuse herself. She knew this instantly. This was a textbook conflict of interest. But something kept her frozen in place, watching him with clinical detachment. Michael had aged, his once jet-black hair now salted with gray at the temples, crow's feet bracketing eyes that had once looked at her with what she'd mistaken for love. His suit hung expensive but loose on his frame, as though he'd recently lost weight. "Your Honor." The clerk's voice finally penetrated her thoughts. Eleanor cleared her throat. "Yes, proceed." The courtroom resumed its mechanical rhythm, a well-oiled machine of dissolution. His wife, soon-to-be ex-wife, Jessica Daniels, sat across the aisle, her posture rigid with the particular kind of tension that came from proximity to someone you once shared everything with and now could barely look at. Eleanor recognized that tension. She had worn it herself, though never in the formal setting of divorce proceedings. Her separation had occurred in a moment, instantaneous and public, leaving her with no legal claims but all the emotional debt. Eleanor studied Jessica's face, the carefully applied makeup that couldn't quite conceal the shadowed hollows beneath her eyes, the way she flinched slightly whenever Michael's attorney spoke. There was a story there, one that went beyond irreconcilable differences. "Mrs. Daniels contends that Mr. Daniels has hidden assets," Jessica's attorney was saying, a sharp-featured woman with perfectly manicured nails that clicked against her tablet as she swiped through documents. "We have reason to believe there are offshore accounts that haven't been disclosed in the financial affidavits." Michael's attorney, a silver-haired man with the comfortable paunch of someone who charged $500 an hour, scoffed. "These allegations are baseless, Your Honor. My client has been fully transparent. Mrs. Daniels is simply bitter about the circumstances of their separation and is attempting to extract punitive damages disguised as her fair share." The circumstances of their separation. Eleanor's legal mind latched onto the phrase, even as her personal history threatened to cloud her judgment. She had spent years rebuilding herself after Michael. Law school completed with honors despite the depression that had nearly swallowed her whole. Clerkships, a promising career in the district attorney's office, and finally, the bench. She had earned her robe through countless sleepless nights and sacrificed relationships, determined to never again be the woman left waiting, powerless and humiliated. "Mr. Holbrook," Eleanor addressed Michael's attorney, her voice steadier than she felt. "Your client's financial disclosures do show some inconsistencies that warrant explanation." Michael looked up then, his eyes meeting hers for the first time. There was no flash of recognition, no widening of pupils that would indicate he remembered her. Why would there be? She had changed. Her once-long chestnut hair now cut in a practical bob, streaked with premature silver. The softness of youth had been chiseled away by stress and determination. The naive girl who had believed in fairy tales was gone, replaced by a woman who understood the letter of the law and the darkness of human nature. "If I may, Your Honor," Michael spoke directly, his voice sending an unwelcome current down Eleanor's spine. It was deeper than she remembered, or perhaps memory had distorted it over time. "These accusations are taking me by surprise. I've worked hard to provide for my family. I've never hidden anything." Liar. The word flashed in Eleanor's mind, unbidden. She remembered finding out, 3 days after he'd left her at the altar, that he'd been having an affair with a colleague, that he'd emptied their joint savings account, money meant for their honeymoon, 2 weeks before the wedding, that he'd been planning his escape while helping her choose wedding cake flavors. "Your financial statements from the last 3 years show irregular transfers to an LLC that doesn't appear to conduct any actual business," Eleanor said, keeping her tone neutral, professional. "The court needs clarification on these matters." Jessica's attorney looked surprised at the judge's detailed knowledge of the case, but pleased. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Eleanor felt a twinge of something, not satisfaction exactly, but something adjacent to it. Dangerous territory. As the hearing continued, Eleanor maintained her judicial demeanor, asking pointed questions, making rulings on objections, setting deadlines for additional financial disclosures. But beneath the surface, memories churned like dark water. The months after the non-wedding had been the darkest of Eleanor's life. Her mother's cancer had returned just weeks later, as if the stress had fed the disease. Eleanor had moved back home, postponing her final year of law school to care for her mother while nursing her own broken heart. The nights spent administering medication, changing sheets, holding her mother's frail hand while simultaneously trying to hold herself together. They had nearly broken her. When her mother finally passed, Eleanor had stood at another ceremony in black instead of white, somehow more alone than she'd been at the church. "Your Honor, my client is requesting temporary spousal support while the financial discovery proceeds," Jessica's attorney was saying. Mrs. Daniels left her career in hospital administration at Mr. Daniels' insistence when they had children. She's been out of the workforce for 8 years and needs support to maintain the household for their children. Michael's attorney interjected, "Mr. Daniels has already been voluntarily providing substantial support. This request is excessive given the circumstances." "And what circumstances would those be, counselor?" Eleanor asked, her pen poised above her notepad. "Mrs. Daniels was unfaithful, Your Honor." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Jessica's face flushed crimson, her eyes downcast. Michael sat straighter, the picture of the wronged husband. Eleanor felt a cold clarity descend. She had seen this before, not just in her courtroom, but in life. The rewriting of narratives, the strategic deployment of shame. She thought of how Michael had somehow spun their story into one where Eleanor had been too focused on the wedding, not the marriage, as mutual friends had later reported back to her. How he had played the reluctant groom who'd finally seen the light, rather than the coward who couldn't face his commitments. The issue before the court today is temporary support, not marital fault, Eleanor said. Michigan is a no-fault divorce state. Mrs. Daniels' alleged infidelity has no bearing on her need for support while caring for minor children. Michael's face darkened. He whispered something to his attorney, who shook his head slightly. Eleanor continued, "I'm granting the motion for temporary support in the amount of $4,000 monthly, retroactive to the date of filing. Additionally, Mr. Daniels will continue to pay the mortgage and utilities for the family home where Mrs. Daniels resides with the children." It was a standard ruling, one she would have made regardless of who sat before her. But the flash of anger in Michael's eyes gave her pause. She recognized that look, the same one he'd given her when she'd suggested postponing their wedding by 2 months to accommodate her mother's first round of chemotherapy. The look that said, "You're not giving me what I want, and that makes you my enemy." As the hearing concluded and the next case was called, Eleanor watched Michael storm out of the courtroom, his attorney hurrying to keep pace. Jessica lingered, gathering her papers with shaking hands. Their eyes met briefly across the now emptying room, and Eleanor saw something there. Relief, gratitude, and the particular exhaustion that came from standing your ground when the earth beneath you was crumbling. Eleanor should have recused herself. She knew this with absolute certainty as she removed her robe in the privacy of her chambers later that afternoon. Her clerk had left a stack of files for tomorrow's cases, and she flipped through them mechanically, trying to focus on the work ahead rather than the past that had unexpectedly crashed into her present. Her phone buzzed with a text from David, the history professor she'd been seeing for the past 6 months. "Dinner tonight? I can cook that pasta you like." Eleanor stared at the message, feeling suddenly distant from the life she'd been carefully building. David was kind, intelligent, patient with her workaholic tendencies and the emotional walls she'd constructed. He didn't know about Michael, not specifically. He knew there had been someone who had hurt her deeply, but she'd never shared the details, never admitted to being the woman left at the altar, a cautionary tale and source of gossip for months afterward. "Can I take a rain check?" "Difficult day in court," she texted back, then set her phone aside before she could see his response. The ethical thing would be to recuse herself from the Daniels case now, to explain to the chief judge that she had a personal history with one of the parties. But something held her back. Not revenge, she told herself, but a sense that Jessica Daniels deserved a fair hearing from someone who wouldn't be charmed or manipulated by Michael's practiced sincerity. Eleanor had seen the signs in the financial disclosures that no one else had caught, the same pattern she'd observed in their joint account all those years ago. Small transfers that added up, money moving through channels designed to obscure its destination. Michael had always been clever with money, and, evidently, he hadn't changed. She left the courthouse through the judge's private exit, avoiding the main lobby where parties from the day's cases sometimes lingered. The October air bit at her cheeks as she walked her car, leaves skittering across the parking lot in the wind. Eleanor had always loved autumn, but since being left at the altar in October, the season had taken on a melancholy edge, the dying year a reminder of things lost. The drive home to her carefully renovated Craftsman in a quiet neighborhood took 20 minutes. Eleanor had bought the house 5 years ago, after her appointment to the bench. It had been a statement to herself more than anyone else, proof that she had rebuilt her life brick by brick, that she could make a home on her own terms. As she unlocked her front door, the silence of the empty house wrapped around her like a familiar blanket. She kicked off her heels, poured a glass of red wine, and carried it to her home office, where she kept copies of her case files. It was irregular to bring work home this way, but Eleanor had always been meticulous, preferring to review details in the quiet of her own space rather than the sterile confines of her chambers. She spread the Daniels file across her desk, examining financial statements and property assessments with the same attention she'd once given to law review articles. 2 hours passed, the wine forgotten as she followed the trail of Michael's finances, making notes in her precise handwriting. There were patterns here, consistent with someone hiding assets, the same patterns that she'd learned to recognize during her years prosecuting white-collar crime before ascending to the bench. A knock at her front door startled her. Eleanor glanced at her watch. Nearly 9. She wasn't expecting anyone. Through the peephole, she saw David, a paper bag from her favorite Thai restaurant in one hand. "I thought if you couldn't come to dinner, dinner could come to you," he said when she opened the door. His smile was tentative, his eyes concerned. "You can tell me to leave if you want to be alone." Eleanor hesitated, acutely aware of the case files spread across her desk, the personal and professional lines she'd been blurring all day. "No, come in. I could use the company." They ate in her kitchen, David filling the silence with stories from his department, campus politics, and the paper he was working on. Eleanor listened, responding in all the right places, but her mind kept drifting back to the courtroom, to Michael's face when he realized the ruling wasn't going his way. "You're somewhere else tonight," David said finally, setting down his fork. "Want to talk about it?" Eleanor considered the question. In the 7 months they'd been dating, she'd maintained certain boundaries, keeping parts of herself carefully guarded. David had respected this, never pushing, but his patience had the quality of someone waiting for a door to open. I had a case today, she began slowly. A divorce. The husband. I knew him. A long time ago. David's eyebrows rose slightly. Knew him how? Eleanor took a deep breath. He was my fiancé, the one who left me at the altar. The words hung in the air between them. David's expression shifted from surprise to understanding, then to concern. That's Jesus, Eleanor. Did you recuse yourself? The question hit like a slap, though she knew it was fair. No. Are you going to? Eleanor pushed her plate away. I should. I know that. But I don't think he even recognized me. It's been 12 years. I look different. I use my maiden name professionally. But you recognized him, David said gently. And you know your history affects how you see him. It doesn't affect my ability to apply the law, Eleanor said, a defensive edge creeping into her voice. If anything, I'm more aware of the dynamics at play. His wife, she has that same look I had, of someone who's been systematically undermined. And he's hiding money, David. I can see in the financials. Then let another judge see it too, David said. Eleanor, you've built your reputation on absolute integrity. Is this worth risking that? Eleanor stood abruptly, carrying her plate to the sink. She knew David was right, but something rebellious within her resisted. For years, she had done everything by the book, had been twice as ethical, twice as careful as her colleagues, aware that as a relatively young female judge, she was under additional scrutiny. The thought of facing the chief judge, explaining her history with Michael, admitting to her lapse in judgment, it filled her with a shame that echoed the humiliation of that long-ago October day. I'll recuse myself tomorrow, she said finally, her back still to David. You're right. Later, after David had gone home with a chaste kiss and concerned eyes, Eleanor lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Sleep eluded her as memories she'd thought long buried resurfaced with painful clarity. She remembered the weight of her wedding dress, suddenly suffocating as the minutes ticked by with no sign of Michael. The murmurs that rippled through the church as the delay stretched from 15 minutes to 30. Her father's hand, steady on her arm as he whispered, "We can wait a little longer, Ellie." The pitying glances from the bridesmaids. The moment when Michael's best man finally approached, ashen-faced, to tell her that Michael wasn't coming, that he'd received a text saying only, "I can't do this. Tell Eleanor I'm sorry." The humiliation had been total, public, and defining. For months afterward, Eleanor could feel people's gazes lingering on her, could hear conversations stopping when she entered a room. She'd fled Ann Arbor for Detroit, changing law schools for her final year, determined to disappear and reinvent herself. Now Michael had reappeared, unaware of the crater he'd left in her life, oblivious to the ways she'd had to rebuild herself from the foundation up. And somehow, inexplicably, she had power in this dynamic. The scales had shifted. Eleanor turned onto her side, punching her pillow into shape. No, she wouldn't use her position to exact revenge. That wasn't who she was. But she wouldn't pretend that her insight into Michael's character wasn't relevant, wasn't valuable in ensuring Jessica received a fair settlement. Sleep finally came, uneasy and filled with dreams where she stood in her judge's robes before an empty church, calling a case that no one appeared for. Morning brought clarity. Eleanor dressed with particular care, choosing a charcoal suit that lent her an air of authority, pearl earrings that had been her mother's. She would speak to the chief judge before court, explain the situation, request a reassignment of the case. It was the only ethical path forward. But when she arrived at the courthouse, there was an unexpected complication. A motion for emergency relief had been filed in the Daniels case overnight. Jessica's attorney alleged that Michael had violated the temporary order by canceling credit cards Jessica relied on for household expenses and children's needs, essentially leaving her without access to funds. The motion was on Eleanor's desk, requiring immediate attention. Protocol dictated that the judge already familiar with the case handle emergency motions unless they were unavailable. To pass this to another judge who would have to get up to speed would delay relief if the allegations were true. Eleanor hesitated, her hand hovering over the phone that would connect her to the chief judge's chambers. The emergency hearing was scheduled for 9:30 a.m., just an hour away. If Michael was retaliating against Jessica for the temporary support ruling by financially strangling her, delay could mean real hardship for the children. With a decision that she knew crossed the line, Eleanor set down the phone. She would handle the emergency hearing, then recuse herself immediately afterward. One more hour with this case, to ensure Jessica and her children weren't left vulnerable while a new judge was assigned. The emergency hearing was contentious from the start. Michael's attorney argued that the credit card cancellations were a simple administrative error by the bank, not a deliberate attempt to circumvent the court's order. Jessica's attorney presented evidence that Michael had called the bank himself to cancel the cards, then withdrew $10,000 from a joint business account that should have remained untouched pending the court's division of assets. Mr. Daniels, Eleanor addressed him directly. Are you aware that violating a court order can result in a finding of contempt? Michael met her gaze with the same charming confidence she remembered, the look that had once made her believe he could do no wrong. Your Honor, this is all a misunderstanding. I've already arranged for new cards to be issued to Mrs. Daniels. There was a fraud alert on the account. I was actually trying to protect our assets. Eleanor noted the calculated use of our assets rather than my assets, the presentation of himself as the responsible protector rather than the controlling saboteur. It was skillfully done, and she could see how another judge might be swayed by his apparent reasonableness. When did you arrange for these new cards? She asked. This morning, as soon as I was made aware of the problem, Michael replied smoothly. So after the emergency motion was filed, Eleanor clarified. Not when Mrs. Daniels called you yesterday to report that her cards had been declined at the grocery store and at your daughter's pediatrician's office. A flicker of annoyance crossed Michael's face. I was in meetings all day. I didn't see her messages until late. Eleanor consulted the exhibits Jessica's attorney had submitted. According to these phone records, you spoke with Bank of America at 2:17 p.m. yesterday, approximately 20 minutes after Mrs. Daniels texted you about the declined cards. The bank representative has provided a statement confirming you requested the cancellation at that time. The courtroom fell silent. Michael's attorney whispered urgently in his ear, but Michael brushed him off, his expression hardening. Your Honor, he said, his voice taking on an edge Eleanor recognized from their past arguments. With all due respect, I feel there's some bias at play here. You seem determined to paint me as the villain before hearing all the facts. It was a calculated move, one designed to put her on the defensive. Eleanor felt a chill run through her. Did he recognize her after all? Was this a veiled threat? Mr. Daniels, the facts I'm referring to are documented in the exhibits before me, Eleanor said, keeping her voice level. If you have contradictory evidence, now is the time to present it. Michael's attorney jumped in. Your Honor, we haven't had adequate time to prepare a response to these allegations. We request a continuance to gather our own documentation. In the meantime, Mrs. Daniels and your children remain without access to funds for basic necessities, Eleanor pointed out. I'm granting the emergency motion. Mr. Daniels, you are ordered to restore Mrs. Daniels' access to credit cards and household accounts immediately, today, and a transfer of $5,000 to the checking account Mrs. Daniels uses for household expenses by close of business. This is not an additional support payment. It will be credited against your next scheduled support payment. She continued. Furthermore, the court finds that your actions constitute a violation of the temporary orders. I'm reserving the issue of contempt for now, but be advised that any further violations will result in sanctions, potentially including attorney's fees. Michael's face had flushed dark red, a vein pulsing visibly at his temple. Eleanor remembered that look. It had always preceded his worst outbursts, the moments when his carefully maintained charm would slip to reveal the anger beneath. This is bullsh, Michael began, but his attorney gripped his arm, silencing him. We understand, Your Honor, the attorney said quickly. My client will comply immediately. As the hearing concluded, Eleanor knew she had delayed too long. She should have recused herself before this hearing. Now, any recusal would look like a reaction to Michael's suggestion of bias, potentially lending credence to a claim that could be used to challenge her ruling. She returned to her chambers, closing the door firmly behind her before pressing her palms against her desk, head bowed, breathing deeply. This had gone too far. She needed to speak to the chief judge immediately, explain everything, accept whatever consequences came. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Her judicial assistant entered, looking concerned. "Judge Reeves, Mrs. Daniels' attorney, is asking to speak with you privately. I told her it wasn't appropriate, but she's insistent. She says it's about information that wasn't presented in the hearing." Eleanor straightened. "You were right to refuse. Tell her to file any additional information with the clerk, and it will be considered in due course." After her assistant left, Eleanor picked up her phone to call the chief judge's office, but another knock interrupted her. This time, it was her clerk, looking uncomfortable. "Judge, there's something you should see." He handed her a tablet. "This was just posted on the courthouse steps. A reporter showed me." On the screen was a social media post from a local news reporter. "Breaking: Judge Eleanor Reeves, presiding over high-profile Daniels divorce, was left at the altar by Michael Daniels 12 years ago. Sources say she never disclosed this conflict." Story developing. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. Someone had made the connection. Perhaps a court employee who had been at her wedding, or a lawyer who remembered the gossip. It didn't matter how. What mattered was that her worst fear had materialized. Her professional integrity was now publicly in question. Her phone began ringing. The chief judge. Eleanor answered, her voice steadier than she felt. "Eleanor, I've just been made aware of a serious situation," Chief Judge Martin said without preamble. "Is it true that you have a personal history with Michael Daniels?" "Yes," Eleanor admitted. "I was coming to speak with you about it this morning. We were engaged many years ago, and you've been presiding over his divorce proceedings?" The disappointment in his voice cut deeper than anger would have. "I recognized him yesterday during the initial hearing," Eleanor said. "I intended to recuse myself immediately, but then the emergency motion was filed, and I was concerned about delay causing hardship." "You should have come to me immediately," Judge Martin interrupted. "You know that, Eleanor. I've reassigned the case to Judge Watkins. You're to turn over all files immediately, and I expect a full written explanation of this lapse on my desk by end of day." "I understand," Eleanor said quietly. "The Judicial Tenure Commission will likely want to review this," he added. "I suggest you retain counsel." After the call ended, Eleanor sat motionless, the magnitude of her error washing over her. The Judicial Tenure Commission, the body that investigated judicial misconduct. At minimum, she would face a public reprimand. At worst, suspension or even removal from the bench. Everything she had worked for, the reputation she had built so carefully, was in jeopardy. Her phone buzzed with texts and calls, colleagues, friends, David. Eleanor ignored them all, focusing instead on writing the explanation Judge Martin had requested, laying out the facts with the same precision she would use in a judicial opinion. No excuses, just the truth. She had allowed personal history to cloud her professional judgment, had rationalized decisions she knew were wrong, had failed in her duty to the court and to the parties before her. By the time she finished, the October sunset was painting her office in shades of amber and gold. Eleanor gathered her personal items, suspecting she might not be returning to this chamber for some time. As she walked through the now-empty courthouse, her footsteps echoed in the marble hallway like a solitary metronome, counting down the seconds of her career. Outside, a few reporters lingered, cameras ready. Eleanor kept her head high, offered a terse no comment, and walked to her car with as much dignity as she could muster. The same dignity she had tried to maintain walking back down the aisle alone 12 years ago. Veil removed, flowers abandoned on the altar steps. The next few weeks unfolded in a blur of meetings with her attorney, appearances before the Judicial Tenure Commission, and painful conversations with Judge Martin. The media coverage was relentless, with opinion pieces debating whether her actions constituted serious misconduct or a human error in judgment. Legal ethics experts weighed in, most concluding that while her failure to recuse was clearly improper, her rulings in the case appeared legally sound and unbiased. Michael gave interviews portraying himself as the victim of a vengeful ex, while carefully avoiding mention of why they had broken up. Eleanor maintained her silence, refusing to engage in a public battle that would only further undermine the dignity of the court. Jessica Daniels reached out through her attorney, offering to provide a statement supporting Eleanor, testifying that the judge's rulings had been fair and based on evidence. Eleanor declined, unwilling to draw Jessica further into the controversy or create the appearance of collusion. The commission's decision, when it finally came, was both a relief and a blow, a 6-month suspension without pay rather than removal from the bench. The opinion acknowledged Eleanor's otherwise unblemished record and the steps she had taken to immediately acknowledge her error, while emphasizing the fundamental importance of judicial impartiality and the appearance of impartiality. On her last day before the suspension began, Eleanor cleared her remaining personal items from her chambers. As she placed framed diplomas and legal texts in cardboard boxes, her judicial assistant appeared at the door. "Someone's here to see you, Judge," she said hesitantly. Jessica Daniels. Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse, but something in her assistant's expression made her pause. "Send her in." Jessica entered cautiously, looking different than she had in court. Less polished, more authentic in jeans and a simple sweater. Her face was drawn with stress, but there was a determination in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "I'm sorry to intrude," Jessica began, "but I wanted to thank you in person." Eleanor shook her head. "You don't owe me thanks, Mrs. Daniels. If anything, I owe you an apology for allowing my personal history to potentially compromise your case." Jessica sat in the chair across from Eleanor's desk without being invited. "The thing is, Judge Watkins might not have caught what you did in those financial statements. Your ruling forced Michael to restore my access to accounts, which gave me time to document everything before he could hide more assets. My attorney says we have a solid case now for financial misconduct." She leaned forward. "I know what Michael did to you. Not just leaving you at the altar. That was public knowledge once this story broke. But the financial manipulation, the gaslighting, making you question your own perceptions. He did the same to me for 10 years. Eleanor remained silent, unwilling to cross more ethical lines by discussing the case. "I'm not here to talk about the divorce," Jessica continued, seeming to read Eleanor's thoughts. "I'm here because I want you to know that seeing you on that bench, successful, respected, someone who had survived what Michael did and built something meaningful, it gave me courage. Whatever happens with the divorce, I'll be okay. My kids will be okay, because I know there's life after Michael Daniels." After Jessica left, Eleanor finished packing her office, her movements more deliberate, less defeated. The suspension would be difficult, financially, professionally, emotionally. The whispers would follow her when she returned to the bench. But she had survived worse. 6 months later, Eleanor returned to a different courtroom in the same courthouse, assigned to criminal cases rather than family law. The story had faded from public interest, though occasionally she caught glimpses of recognition in attorneys' eyes, subtle assessments of whether her judgment could be trusted. She approached each case with renewed commitment to the principles that had guided her to the bench in the first place: fairness, impartiality, and the unwavering application of the law. The experience had humbled her, reminded her of her own humanity and fallibility, made her a more thoughtful jurist. Eleanor never saw Michael in her courtroom again, though she heard through legal circles that his divorce had been finalized, with significant financial penalties for his attempts to hide assets. Jessica had returned to her career in hospital administration and was reportedly thriving. On the anniversary of her return to the bench, Eleanor received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a newspaper clipping about a legal clinic for domestic violence survivors that Jessica had helped establish, along with a handwritten note. "Some good can come from the worst chapters of our lives. Thank you for showing me that." Eleanor placed the clipping in her desk drawer, a private reminder that justice takes many forms, and that sometimes the most important verdicts are the ones we render in our own lives when we refuse to let past wounds define our future.